Good evening. Welcome to Istanbul Modern. And this evening we will have the new lecture of our series, Museums Talk from the United Kingdom. And David Anderson, National Museum Wales Director, is our guest. First of all, I would like to thank him for joining us. Welcome to Istanbul, David. And I would like to give you a brief introduction about National Museum Wales. Founded in 1907, National Museum Wales operates 7 national museums working in different disciplines encompassing art, history, national history, and industrial heritage. Dedicated to preserving, presenting, and promoting the culture of Wales, the institution is facing severe challenges of funding and purpose. It's on a journey to redefine its role in Wales, the world's first post-industrial nation, one rich in cultural traditions but poor in economic resources. Awarded an OBA services to museums and education, David Anderson has been Director General of National Museum Wales since 2010 and reorganized the institution to enable it to become better fitted to meet the needs of the people of Wales in the 21st century. In his talk, he will present the redevelopment of St. Fagans Museum near Cardiff to become the National Museum of History for Wales. Themes will include the development of a new vision and purpose for the museum, fundraising, and the role of public participation in reshaping the works of the organization. And I would like to thank the British Council Turkey for this wonderful collaboration. Now it's my pleasure to invite Margaret Jack, the British Council Turkey Director, to take the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Çok teşekkürler Levent Bey. Thank you very much indeed. And hoş geldiniz, as Levent Bey says. Welcome to the third museums talk from the UK, featuring David Anderson, Director of National Museum Wales. And we're delighted to be collaborating with Istanbul Modern to curate a programme of stimulating talks and maintaining a successful museum, particularly in times of uncertainty and times of change, and to bring an inspiring lineup of speakers from museums across the whole of UK. We feel that through this programme, we're able to share knowledge and expertise with audiences here in Turkey, reflecting not just on the major projects in the UK making international headlines, but also on the innovative and imaginative approaches of projects like Making History at St. Fagans by National Museum of Wales, which can tell the story of the peoples who live there from the very first human inhabitants to the present day and beyond. It's a great example of how a world-class museum is able to contribute to the economy through cultural heritage, through cultural tourism and job creation, pass cultural heritage on to the next generation, and contribute to the social cohesion and identity of a local community. And we feel that this is an example that could perhaps be adapted and applied to similar situations here in Turkey. A few words about Wales. Wales is one of the 4 nations that make up the United Kingdom. It has a population of 3 million people, actually the same as Bursa, where David is speaking tomorrow. It's famous for its natural beauty, historic castles, and an industrial heritage built on coal mining. And Wales has a very strong connection to Turkey. At the time of the tragic Sommer mining disaster last year, the Welsh miners' leader was among the first in the world to offer aid and send condolences, saying, "People in Wales know the price of coal. Once you cut coal, you don't forget." Everyone in the mining communities of Wales sends their thoughts to those trapped and to those working to free them. They are our brothers. Wales has a rich and very distinctive culture, including its own music and language. Around a quarter of school children in Wales now receive their education not through the medium of English, but through the medium of Welsh. it can claim one of the oldest unbroken literary traditions in Europe, stretching back to the 6th century, and it can pride itself on a rich and expanding contemporary art scene. Comprised of artist-led spaces, museums, and a variety of galleries, the artistic scene is characterised by its heritage, but also, importantly and critically, as we'll hear this evening, by exciting new developments in Welsh art in communities across Wales. And let me just share 4 brief examples with you. The famous poet Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea in South Wales 100 years ago. Today, the Dylan Thomas Prize is awarded every 2 years to recognise the best published writer in English under the age of 30 anywhere in the world. Another example, founded around a kitchen table in 1987, today Hay-on-Wye in mid-Wales is home to the world's most famous literary festival. Over the last 3 decades, Hay Festival's audience has grown from 1,000 people up to 250,000 visitors from 53 countries. And when Bill Clinton came to town, he called it the Woodstock of the Mind. To celebrate the opening of St David's Concert Hall in Cardiff in 1983, BBC Wales, the local channel of BBC, the national television channel, organised a competition for opera and art singers. 30 years on, the biennial BBC Cardiff Singer of the World is regarded as the most important operatic competition in the world. And finally, an example in the visual arts. Founded in 2002 by Welsh artist William Wilkins, the Artes Mundi Prize is held in Cardiff every 2 years and is the largest art prize in the UK and one of the most significant in the world. The award identifies, recognises and supports contemporary visual artists who engage with the human condition, social reality and lived experience. So you see, size is not all in culture. I'd now like to hand over to David to tell us more and share his experience in rethinking museums, rethinking culture. Thank you. Please enjoy your evening and çok teşekkürler. Sağ olun.
Thank you for your words, Margaret. Thank you for the invitation. I want to start by saying something perhaps provocative about the United Kingdom, which is that at one time, the United Kingdom was synonymous with England. And say 100 years ago, its purpose was empire. Today, what's the purpose of the United Kingdom? What is its narrative? What is the integrating, binding set of ideas that, if you like, can bring its peoples together and can enable it to contribute, if you like, to the world? I believe it doesn't have one. And this is a major part of the problem, really, that its cultural institutions face. When Britain declares itself to be Great Britain, cool Britannia, a hub of creativity, these days, most of the funding, most of the media attention is focused on London. The reality is that the UK is much more rich and complex than that, but we don't share a common narrative. We have not got over our imperial past. We can't let go of that vision of ourselves as being militarily powerful, with the right to intervene over the world, and united around those kind of purposes. Where this becomes difficult is if you are in a country like Wales, where the industry has largely disappeared, the mines that Margaret referred to have closed, the steel industry still exists to a small extent, but employs relatively few people, and has now landscapes of post-industrial poverty. 1 in 3 children in Wales live in poverty. Large numbers of young people, particularly in the old industrial areas, are unemployed. Great Britannia, cool Britannia, is completely meaningless to those communities. And if you are a national museum, you then have to ask yourself, what kind of museum does Wales need? And therefore, what do we have to do to reshape ourselves? Museums across the world share very many things, common standards, particularly conservation technical standards. But it is vitally important, I would argue, that museums grow from their communities and are able to provide visions for the future for their communities, where such narratives are not being provided by our politicians and others. So, the question, the challenge that I and my colleagues at national museums have then is to try to construct a sense of purpose and to ask what our legitimacy is, if you like, what our democratic legitimacy is too. So everything I have to say from now on is an attempt to explore those questions, an attempt to provide a reason for us as a museum to exist at a time when public sector funding in Britain is declining, when the neoliberal ideologies, which are so dominant in many parts of Europe, are very strongly embedded in the Westminster government and are being imposed on us in Wales, in many ways against the voting wishes of the people of Wales. We remain, in a sense, a colony of England in terms of how funding is structured, how many key parts of government policy are defined. So in this almost colonial existence that we have, how do we as a museum, where do we look to for our models? And the answer is very rarely to London. The divide, the funding divide, the cultural divide, the political divide between London and the north of England, London and Scotland, London and Wales, is growing wider and wider. And that divide has to be reflected in the way in which we, in Wales, in our museums, think about our purpose. So that's our starting point. Three themes: unprecedented challenges, social and economic. I want to argue that, and this should not be controversial in a museum, that we might look to the past to see whether there are any guides to the future. Secondly, that museums are most effective when they're rooted in their societies. And those cultures and those societies are different, and therefore what I'm not saying is that the solutions we may find in Wales are necessarily the solutions in London, obviously. certainly not necessarily in Turkey, but you can judge for yourselves. Thirdly, that the future for us lies in developing creative approaches to cultural participation. A rather poor image, I apologize for this. The Great Exhibition of 1851, a very radical act by the UK government to open up culture to, as it turns out, 6 million visitors to this international exhibition. And it was brave because it showed that they could trust the public to come in large numbers to London to see the exhibition without rioting and without attacking Parliament, which had been the great fear 2 or 3 years earlier in 1848, the year of revolution in Europe. And the director of the South Kensington Museum, who was also in charge of the education system in Britain, a radical act again, was quite clear that he wanted this museum to be different from the British Museum and other museums. As he says, a book with its pages open and not shut. That was his speech in his inaugural lecture. He was determined that working people should be able to visit the museum, and so he introduced evening opening, for example, as one of the ways to do that. And as he says, on Monday nights especially, great numbers are strictly of the working classes. And he was proud of that. His fellow directors in London at that time could never have made that statement. And he initiated what to me still looks like a breathtakingly ambitious experiment, which was to say that education, learning, and culture are indivisibly connected. And the whole education system and the great network of museums that he created across the United Kingdom was intended to work together to a purpose, which was to enable people, and this is, again, remember the imperial industrial period, to be consumers of good design, to be creators of good design, and also to develop the designers of the future. Very strong vision. Now, we may not share his objectives today, but that vision of the integration of culture and learning, I still think is powerful. Decades later, William Morris, in his utopian novel, News from Nowhere, took a much more cynical and critical eye to look at museums as part of the society of the future that he created. And one of his most recent biographer, Fiona McCarthy, said that what drove him into revolutionary activism was his anger and shame at the injustices of society. Well, if William Morris was alive today and in Britain, he would be equally angry, equally driven to revolutionary activism by what he sees. But for him, museums did not exist for themselves. They could only justify their existence because of the way they might enrich daily life. So for him, it's the household goods, it's the landscape, it's the towns we live in, it's even the proper upkeep of the roads that were the defining marks of a civilization. And in News from Nowhere, the South Kensington Museum has disappeared entirely to be replaced by woods and streams. That can't be an accident because William Morris was closely connected to that museum. So he in his book has swept this aside in the future in disgust. The Houses of Parliament have become a storage place for manure. The British Museum has somehow survived, but in very reduced circumstances, as has the National Gallery. He had, I believe, become utterly disillusioned with the elitism of the national museums of the time. And he argues that the National Gallery is of little importance because the art that people are producing in this utopia in the future is so much more significant than that had been produced in the past, this being William Morris and utopianism. But fundamental to everything for him was the education of desire, the stimulation of a wish to enhance the quality of our lives. And for him, that was the purpose, in a sense, of everything that should be done for citizens. Nothing could be further away from the work of many of our museums in the United Kingdom during the 20th century than that ambition. So for him, it's culture and action, the uses of culture for learning, creativity and pleasure that define the quality of a society. Andrew Carnegie, born in Dunfermline in Scotland, went to the United States, made his fortune there, but then was driven to, from a conscience perhaps, of his industrial behavior to some degree, to try to put part of that wealth back into society. And in 1904, he gave £500,000, a vast amount of money in those days, to the city of Dunfermline and a group of trustees who he'd appointed to come up with an imaginative scheme to improve the quality of life of every citizen of his hometown. As he said, to bring into the monotonous lives of the toiling masses of Dunfermline some charm, some happiness, some elevating conditions of life, which residents elsewhere would have denied. But he also says, you are pioneers, and do not be afraid of making mistakes. Not what other cities have is your standard. It is something beyond this that they lack. So that was the mission, that was the challenge. And one of the people who was appointed to come up with ideas for this was Patrick Geddes, the sociologist, the town planner, the biologist, the radical thinker in almost every area of life. And some 20, 30 years into his professional life, this became the pinnacle of his effort to bring together everything that he thought and everything that he believed. So he went around the city and he photographed pretty well every square meter, right down to these sewage pipes, which he photographed at first, and then 3 weeks later, after a storm, he came back and photographed the same spot again after the storm had taken away part of the hillside, including the pipes. So the sewage was just spilling down into the stream below. Like Morris, it was the quality of everything in our lives that he felt needed to be addressed. And this is a photograph. He took a photographer with him every step of the way for 3 months, photographing, drawing, thinking. So this is a photograph of part of the city. And then painstakingly, he painted over the photographs to create a vision of how that space could be. And this is one of the grander images that he did. But there were many that were much more routine, much more mundane, really. And he ended up his publication with an image of the entire city transformed by, as he said, museum thinking. The museum spirit he wanted to infuse everywhere in the entire city, in its design, but equally importantly, in how it was made. Because he wanted the children, the boys, girls, to be part of the group of people who would rebuild the city. He wanted to have them to make a Japanese garden. Everything that you saw in those images there was to be built by the people themselves. They were to be trained, they were to be apprentices. In schools, they were to have the opportunity to make, design, to create, to rethink. So this was to be cultural regeneration from the ground up by the people, not imposed on them from above. And he did say that for him, I have no faith in the educational value of the Commonplace Art Museum with its metal masterpieces in a glass case and the smithy nowhere. A very radical statement, because largely what we had in museums in those days was metal masterpieces in a glass case, and frankly, what we largely still have in museums is metal masterpieces in a glass case. Thinking has not really moved on that far, has it, in many museums? What is the theoretical basis of the work that we so often do? What is the social basis for the work that we so often do? What is the ethics of what we do? And with a small p, what is the politics too. This is ethical, this is political, this is aesthetic, this is social, this is all those things combined. And we have choices, really, as to whether our museums are deeply and truly integrated into our communities and into our society, or whether they stand apart and are separate from them. Geddes said that what he wanted to create was not utopia, no place, but eutopia, good place, practical, made by hand, in a sense, made by ourselves. F.E. Mcwilliam, Northern Irish artist, I just by chance came across his gallery during this last summer and was very struck by some words of his, which the gallery had set out as a manifesto almost, really, on the walls. And he said, I was born lucky where I was in a country town. In those days, everything was made in the town. Now, immediately, I mean, I don't know about Turkey, but in the United Kingdom, to say that everything was made in your town is beyond memory and is beyond imagination. Virtually everything is made elsewhere. As they say of many, many towns in Wales, the goods come in, the money goes out. That's the equation. Wasn't like that. How did this happen to us? For him, he said, next door to our house was Carson the Cooper, who made barrels. Then there was the shop that sold furniture, where they made the furniture behind the shop. I loved going in and watching them. And essentially what he was saying was, he could not have been the artist he was if he had not grown up in that environment. Banbridge, the town, was a linen town. I mean, you'd never heard of it at all. Hardly anybody has. The mill dams gave us swimming pools, and in summer, blue fields, when the flax was in flower, and white fields when the linen was spread out to bleach. Magical intrusions in the normal patchworks of green. The foundations of an artist, in his view of himself. Who now could be an artist from that source? In Britain, few enough. So I want to argue that there are alternative views of museums from our past that we can draw on. The concept of the public being creative is one that has deep roots in the United Kingdom as well. This particular project, Shamiana, the Mughal Tent, was a project for Asian women's groups in London. I was working at the V&A at the time. It wasn't my project. I'm very proud that it was my department, colleague in my department, who led this. The women's group started off by taking the mirab shape and deciding among themselves that they would each create panels in that shape, roughly more than 2 meters high. The one in the center is an interesting story, I think, because a group of girls aged 16 or 17 from East London, from the Bangladeshi Bengali community, came into the museum. They'd been brought in. Now, Shireen Akbar, who was the project leader for Shamiana, was herself Bangladeshi. And she was passionate about girls' education, women's education. The girls came in, they went around the gallery of Indian art, and they were bored. And at the end of the tour with Shireen, they said, what has this got to do with us? We live in this country, we were born in this country, England. This culture was 300 years ago, 400 years ago. You showed us an image of Mumtaz, who you say inspired the Taj Mahal. But where is her portrait? I can only see portraits of men. So this was a challenge to Shireen, and she spent the next half hour debating with the girls about the meaning of all this. And at the end of that half hour, the girls went away saying they would create an image of Mumtaz, since none existed. That image in the center is the one. And her hands are across her face because they wanted to show that she's hidden, in a way, visually in history. And she is shown as the tree of life. And the roots, they said, were those things that in their lives, this is the girls in London in the 1990s, were holding them back. And the things that were sprouting from her fingers, they said, were those things that they wanted for their future. An education, a chance to travel, the chance to choose whoever they would marry. All their aspirations and all their feelings in a way, and this was a group effort to create this, went into that image there. And in a way, they filled a gap in the museum itself as well. And one of them said, at last I discovered me and what I wanted to become. We have all blossomed in our own ways and have gone on to achieve that which we would never have dreamt to be within our grasp. We have not lost our Asian identities. In fact, I would say we are now closer to it than we've ever been. Something very different, an exhibition, Breathless, about photography and time. And this exhibition at the V&A was the source of a project for young people on that same theme, photography and time. And the challenge which was given to thousands of young people who were doing photography courses was, what is your interpretation of that theme? Use photography to explore it. This is just one of, as I say, many hundreds and even thousands of responses that those young people made. This was a girl who discovered photographs of her mother at the same age as she was herself at the time. And she decided that she was going to try to replicate with herself in the photographs the images that had been taken of her mother. So this is the result. And in this, it becomes difficult to know who is mother, who is daughter, what is original, what is created. And it's also, I would believe, and I spoke to both the mother and the daughter when we exhibited these photographs in the museum, I would believe also it's, in a sense, a testimony to a relationship between mothers and daughters as well. But there are many meanings that could be made of it. But I suppose the question is, why does not every young person get the opportunity to respond creatively to collections in ways that give them the chance to show what they're able to do? Why does it have to be special projects that are designed that way? Why can't it be integral to the work of museums and integral to the lives of young people as well? But so often this sort of work is regarded as marginal, not core to what museums do. Another project, which I'll flash on a photograph. The project was called Every Object Tells a Story, and its aim was to capture stories from across the United Kingdom and to put them together on that theme of Every Object Tells a Story. And we bought an old London taxi and converted it into a video and audio studio so that people could sit in the back of the taxi and tell their story about an object. And if it was small enough and they brought it with them, could even show the object while they were telling the story. Now, the story I just want to mention here is one that, in fact, was not contributed in that way. Somebody just loaded it up on the website. And the story was about a letter that she had inherited from, the woman had inherited from her mother. During World War II, a young man got married, and almost immediately the young man was taken overseas to fight in the war. And he sent letters back, and they were delivered. Well, except after the war, the man came back to his wife, and they had 2 daughters. This actually is in the steel area of Wales. And then, after time, the steel industry closed, and the street where they'd lived was knocked down, and they moved elsewhere. And then, years later, the husband died. The children had grown up, had their own lives elsewhere. And eventually, the woman, much older by now, remarried and moved again. The whole area that they'd had when they were a young couple had disappeared. Then one night, there was a knock on the door. The post office had found a bag of letters from the period of the Second World War hidden in a wall which had been knocked down. And they decided, even though it was 50 years later, that they were going to try to deliver every letter that they could to the recipient if they were still alive. So at night, there was a knock on the door and there was a postman there. And the letter from the former young husband to his wife was handed to her over the doorstep. And the daughter said afterwards, in a moment, her world turned upside down. That's a story which I find it hard to imagine a museum would have displayed of its own volition, or even known about. But if you give people the chance to tell their own stories about their own objects, the most wonderful flowers can bloom. The most extraordinary stories of human experience can come together. And if we don't embrace that knowledge, that creativity that's in our communities, it's not just our audiences who are impoverished, it's us, ourselves, as museum professionals. Through participation in culture, we can understand how to make a bowl, or a painting, or a film. But equally importantly, we learn that this is our inalienable human right to be creative. And that those institutions in nations like the United Kingdom, which have signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have also signed up to a commitment to deliver the cultural rights of their people. And those cultural rights are to participate fully, to be creative. Not just to visit when the lights are turned on in a museum or gallery, but actually to be creative themselves. Our job is to be catalysts, to stimulants of the creativity of the public. But if, on the other hand, we fail to encourage that participation, we're effectively teaching people that they do not have that right. And in so many museums, and again, I can only speak in the United Kingdom here, in so many museums still, and I have to say, and particularly in some of our largest national institutions, the message is given that we do not have that right to participate. And that's wrong. Csikszentmihalyi, an American philosopher, in his book, The Art of Seeing, says that the life of every member of society would be impoverished if the skills of encoding human experience in works of beauty and the skills of decoding it were lost. And note he puts those two things together, both to encode and to decode, both to create and to understand. We would then be condemned to live within the limits of our human existence. So there is a challenge, if one accepts that, in that statement philosophically as to what we should do. Margaret mentioned that there are 7 sites for the National Museum. The great bulk of the population in Wales live in the former coalfields and the former industrial areas in South Wales. We have 4 industrial museums: wool, coal, slate, and a maritime industrial museum. Number 8 on your list there, the Waterfront Museum. We have a Roman Legion Museum, National Museum Cardiff, which is natural history and art, and then St Fagans National History Museum, which is traditionally the social history museum for Wales. And this is St Fagans. I want to talk about this because this, for me, is a kind of case study of the challenges of trying to put into action what I've been talking about. And I have to say that we're just getting started on the physical construction of the new museum. Historically, its role has been to preserve the life of the people, if you like, from the ground up. Buildings from all over Wales have been brought together at St Fagans, which is in South Wales, near Cardiff, to preserve them when otherwise they would have been destroyed. And they're intended to be a kind of 3-dimensional buildings history of the lives of ordinary people. It was a pioneering museum because history from the bottom up was very rare in Britain anyway, 50, 60 years ago, and is still quite rare in truth today. But few places are as loved by people in Wales as St Fagans. And it has powerful emotional appeal, very much to the heart. It has its problems. When it was created in 1948, it was intended as a bastion of the Welsh language, which was truly greatly under threat at that stage. It wasn't that much earlier than if you were a child speaking Welsh in a school, you'd be punished, and consistently as well. So it was to protect the Welsh language. Welsh is still the dominant language at that museum, as it is at 3 of the 7 museum sites in our national museums. It also was rural. It was an act of defiance, if you like, to the industrialisation, which was still very strong in Wales. And it was of a particular religious group, the nonconformist Protestant religion as well. The chapels were there. At that time, no Catholic churches, or let alone a mosque or anything of that sort. So it had its problems, very much. Wales today is a very different country than it was in 1948. And we now need to build a new national institution, which is to be a national museum of history for Wales. In other words, not just to look at the past, but also to think about what the past is and what it can be. So these are images of some of the new buildings there. This is the whole site. It's on a very large area of landscape, largely wooded. And the buildings are scattered through the site. An example of what the museum has done, this was a medieval church from 700 or 800 years ago or more, taken down brick by brick when it was derelict, and reassembled brick by brick, and then restored in the form that it would have been shortly before the Protestant Reformation. And we were lucky enough to find wall paintings underneath the whitewash of the interior walls to reconstruct it. So very typical example of what St Fagans does. But we argue now that the warm view of the past that St Fagans has represented, that appeals so much to the heart, is not enough. One has to also engage the head, and in particular, thinking critically about the past and exploring those areas of Welsh history which are not comfortable for people in Wales. For example, miner solidarity. Now, there's a great truth in that the miners were very solid during the 1980s strikes, but not all the miners supported that position, and some actually argued against the strike, and certainly argued against the miners' leaders. We need to tell those stories, which are ones of unsolidarity, as well as recognizing the solidarity where it was. That's uncomfortable. And there are many, many more examples. We will try to be brave in facing uncomfortable truths, if you like. One of the things that St Fagans is very strong for is the idea that it is people, not objects, that carry culture. Fundamentally important principle that was there at the foundation of the museum. And we need to remember and develop. Culture cannot exist without humans. It's a living process. It's the only way in which culture operates. So sharing stories, sharing life experiences, and sharing skills in a welcoming and social environment is completely integral to what St Fagans will be, and to some degree has been. Loved though it is, for visitors, St Fagans at the moment is a passive experience. You can see the blacksmith making horseshoes. You can see the baker making bread. Many of those things. But it's not active for you as a visitor, and still less is it participatory. The 3 boys you can see on the right-hand side there started working every Friday at the museum about 3 years ago. The reason they were there was because they were on the point of being thrown out of school. And the school wanted to find something that would engage them. Remember, the poverty manifests itself in all sorts of other social problems in Wales as well. So these are 3 very challenged boys. So they joined our historic buildings unit, the ones who build reconstruct the buildings. And they loved it. Had no behavior problems at all with them. They completely joined in. So much so that all the people in the school they went to wanted to join this group as well and started to misbehave in class in order that they could have the same reward as they thought their fellow students had had. So we had to then start to devise programs for a much wider group of children from that school, that local school. But again, what is it that's wrong with our formal education, for those children anyway, that's so right about what that kind of participation does for them? Is it entirely them who is wrong, or is it us as a society that shapes their choices in this kind of way? The new museum will also have a centre for learning, a very large one. Apprenticeships, volunteer programs, the opportunity to explore our very extensive oral history collections. For the voice of relatives, we've got thousands of hours of recordings of people from all over Wales, and many, many people will have a relative who's recorded in those archives, which we're now digitizing and bringing out. But again, if we're going to make participation real, we have to provide the spaces and the opportunities and the people with the skills to do that. We're going to have a new building, as well as the heart, which St Fagans has always represented, and the head, which we'll try and build into the critical thinking in galleries. There is another key part of being human, which is the hand, the making. And this word in Welsh, I am told by those who can speak Welsh, and I can't, means workshop. I'm told it also means an awful lot more that I can't understand in English, but it means workshop, but it's also home, I'm told, as well, too. So it's a kind of home for making, if you like, I'm told. But this new building will be dedicated to the inspiring people to make for themselves, going back to William Morris, going back to Patrick Geddes, and going back to Mcwilliam, come to that, in Northern Ireland. That we need spaces where we can put the collections alongside the workbench. And we can bring in people who've got far more skills than our museum alone has got to train and to help people to make. We want everybody who comes to St Fagans, so far as possible, to have the opportunity to join in on making, but also to be inspired to make, because it is integral to being human. And in a way, this is an argument for the 21st century. It's actually an argument against neoliberalism as well, and the idea that making can be shifted across the globe wherever it is cheapest and the exploitation can be worst to do that. That actually it's our right to make, it's our right to create. That has not been taken away from us by economic systems, however much we have been persuaded, perhaps culturally and politically, that it has. So there is a political statement in this with a small p. There's, I hope, a humane statement in this too, about what it is to be human and the inalienable right of humans as well, and the dignity that comes with working with the hand and the heart and the head in combination. Everywhere in these images, some of them historical videos, films, we'll show them there, some of them contemporary, the hand. Everywhere, everywhere, the hand in this. And not just in this one building, but across the whole site as well. One of the things that we're going to build is reconstruct a building that doesn't exist. This is the 13th century Great Hall from the far northwest of Wales, Llys Rosir. This comes from an excavation by our archaeologists of the palaces of the Princes of Gwynedd. who were the closest that Wales came to having its own kingdom until roughly 700 years ago, the English invaded and took over. So in the way that we did with the church, but this time starting with archaeological and historical evidence, we're going to reconstruct the Great Hall. And if we can, every night of the year, school children will come and join in the feast, listen to the poetry and the song, perform themselves, and then finally sleep in the Great Hall overnight as well. And it is at the moment being built by apprentices and by volunteers. So again, it's not us alone who should make this. It is as many people as possible, so that those boys from the school who were excluded, in 10 or 15 years' time, can bring their own children and say, I built part of that. I am part of that. We've involved over 130 groups in the project, and we've created a huge range of participatory forums. And so far, 72 museum staff have been involved practically in actually working with the public in this kind of way. Integral to this has been working with the public, co-production. Every decision about the museum of any substance has been worked through, discussed. We brought the designers to work with school groups, to work with community groups, to debate the design, to decide what objects should be displayed and were not displayed. We're trying to take the concept of co-production as far as we can, but it can go further. We know that. This, for us, is the beginning of the way we will work in this museum, and we hope across the rest of the national museums, year by year into the future. At every one of those hundreds of forums, we recorded every word that the public were saying to us. These are just a few samples of them. And behind all this, then, is the challenge we've had, and I'm sorry there's so much text in English here, but I'll explain what this is, of developing a new vision for the museum. So this is in one page, is our vision map. And what we're starting from is to say, well, what is our vision for the Museum for Wales? Inspiring people right at the top, changing lives. It's perhaps easier if I put on the next page the key concepts that we're embedding in this. That we want, as far as possible, to inspire people. And that's a bold ambition in itself. We also want, as far as possible, for that experience to be one which, for those people who want it or need it, can be life-changing. And that's a very difficult task. But we believe it's an ambition worth setting ourselves, because we know that it can happen for some people. Remember those kids from the school who were excluded, who have, in some small way, had their lives changed. One of the great things I think about culture is that it has the power to move people, to work through people, and ultimately, in some ways, to change people in ways that they respond to and they want, not that we impose upon them. It's for us to provide the experiences and the opportunities as cleverly as we can, and in such a diverse way as we can. But ultimately, we are only, at the end of the day, the servants of this process, and we should not be the masters of it at all. And that's why the co-production process is so important in all this, that it should truly come from that dialogue between the organisation and the people. And I think we should be conscious that behind us are those millions who've lived, in this case, on the land of Wales. And in many, many ways, their stories have not been told. And one could imagine that they await the justice of history. And before us, those millions yet to be born. We cannot know what their challenges will be. But it is our responsibility to make sure that what is handed to them is as strong and as powerful as it can be to support them in those decisions they'll have to face and those challenges they'll have to overcome. And that means we don't just hand them over objects. We are able to help them to keep their culture That is a vital, vital part of that, the intangible element, that culture is ultimately inside us as humans. It's not in any object, however valuable, however beautiful. That is a catalyst, it has huge value, huge potential, but unless we turn that potential into reality, we're not doing our job as a museum. This was a project that we did with a group of refugees and asylum seekers. And as you can imagine, given the turmoil of the last 10 years or so in the globe, many from Somalia have come to Wales, Syria and other countries that you'll be only too well aware of. And what we did was to work with the asylum seekers and refugee communities in South Wales and discuss with them how a museum could represent and give them a voice, if you like. And what they eventually asked us to do was to display 3 spaces that were the spaces and the objects that belonged to real refugees and asylum seekers. So there was a bedroom, there was a kitchen, and there was a living room. Each a reconstruction of that room from somebody's home, with the furniture as it was. And they themselves then stayed in those rooms, talking to the public for the 6 weeks that the exhibition was on. And you can imagine that the people of Wales are like people in many other countries. Some were very hostile to people who came from abroad and took every opportunity to say to them, you do not belong here, you're taking our jobs, you're costing us to support you, you should go back to the country that you came from. Other people were the opposite, and they said, we're glad to have provided you with refuge, you enrich our lives, as well as, we hope, helping yours, you're welcome. Everything between those 2 things. And debates and discussions went on in these spaces over the period of the 6 weeks. But we also set everybody who came into the space, every visitor, the challenge of sitting the test that asylum seekers and refugees have to pass now in Britain before they can get British citizenship. And the interesting thing is that about 80% of us who are born and brought up in Britain, when set the test, fail it. The questions are too hard for us. What is Queen Elizabeth II's birthday, for example? I've no idea. Why does it matter? You know, why should anybody be failed the test for not being able to answer that question? Some of them are not quite as stupid as that, but some are. It was a very sensitive thing to do, and I was very nervous about this project because, in a sense, the refugees and asylum seekers are putting their lives and the challenges of their lives on public display. And we have a responsibility as a museum to be very careful about working so closely inside people's lives as that. But so far as I'm aware, the people who took part in it felt it was extremely worthwhile, and the asylum and refugee communities also altogether in South Wales also were very supportive and very positive about it. But it is difficult work. National Theatre Wales recently have done a piece of theatre called Border Game, where as a participant in the theatre, you are told that you're now into the near future. There's been a rampant disease in England, and many English people are trying to escape across the border into independent Wales, where there is no such disease. They've managed to keep it out. Could have been Ebola, could have been whatever. So you then are put in the position of being an asylum seeker or a refugee trying to get into Wales. And you have to travel by train, you have to face the border guards, you have to be questioned, you may be identified as a terrorist. But interestingly, as part of that, I was actually singled out for interrogation when I took part in this, and I was taken into the basement of a small house, anonymous house, just over the border into Wales. And there, a policeman interrogated me with a camera on the wall, filming the interrogation. And it was then relayed to hundreds of people online, like May, who then voted as to whether I was to be allowed into Wales or not. Co-production, active citizen, even that can have its dark side. So in Wales, there is a very strong co-production ethos a very democratic ethos that is beginning to shape quite powerfully the nature of our cultural institutions. And I wanted to include this quote because I think we're thinking of the asylum seekers and the refugees. Amin Maalouf, I don't know whether any of you have come across, I think he's Lebanese, but based in France, at least when I last heard anyway, his book on identity, about us having two heritages, the vertical one, the one in a sense that we inherit, and also the horizontal one, the one that grows with us really through our life experiences. And he's arguing that to him it seems that the latter, the horizontal one that we acquire, is becoming more and more powerful in our lives. And he says we're becoming beings woven out of multicolored threads. And there's a salutary lesson in that for a museum that's trying to create a national museum of history, to remember always that those multicolored threads from all over the world are part of the fabric of our own society as well. And this is a quotation from a museum publication about 10 years ago, saying really that the museum and its collections are just the shell. And that actually the museum is something much more important, which is a way of looking, a way of thinking, a place of stories and ideas. A natural and cultural history, a world of objects, memories, and the art of living. A place for debate of all the issues connected with the society we actually live in. And I wanted to finish with this image. When digital cameras first arrived, the V&A where I was working then did a project where we said to our visitors, borrow a camera, give us your credit card so we know we'll get it back, go off and take some photographs and come back and design a poster on the theme of the V&A, a place for people. We had no control over what they photographed or how they did it. And one night, when we looked at the images that had been created, we found this poster, which the person who took it had described as being forbidden love. We don't normally encourage visitors to kiss statues, of course, the conservation department particularly. But nevertheless, I've just used that as a kind of symbol of the need for us just perhaps to step back and rethink our relationship, and the relationship between museums and collections and the public. Thank you. I'm told that sometimes you ask questions, but you're under no obligation to do so at all. I mean, what I'm doing here is laying down a challenge to the Tate Gallery, the British Museum, and all those imperial institutions that have elements of public participation and have elements of public engagement, but they are not at the core. And I'm saying these things should be at the core. And this is not a very popular argument within Britain, where we still have a very hierarchical structure for the arts and culture. But I believe as austerity and neoliberalism just is eroding our communities. I mean, nobody's quite like Greece as far as I'm aware. But actually, there's a little Greece in Merthyr in South Wales and in Newport in South Wales and other places as well. And these communities need something different. They need a new model of culture and museums. The one that we've been complacent about for decades and decades and decades is not adequate and is not working for many people. And however badly and incompetently we do it, we're trying to develop a different model. And I know we will fail in all sorts of ways, but I do think that this journey is worth taking, because I do believe that so many of our population in Britain need something different now. That's what we're trying to do. I'm trying to provoke you into asking a question. Okay.
I don't know if it's very relevant, but I just wonder when you are trying to to what kind of characteristics that you give importance when you are setting a group together in order to work on this new challenge?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Going back to the museum management bit of that, which I probably didn't talk enough about. We have employed very, very few new people in the last 4 or 5 years because we can't afford to. Because of the Westminster cuts, London cuts, we will, in a few years' time, 17, 18, we'll have about only 60% of the real budget that we had in 2010 to 11. So it's the existing staff. I am very lucky in that I have, particularly in St Fagans, but in other departments too, some curators who are utterly visionary. But there is something about democracy in Wales. It is a much more democratic society. I have to be blunt about this, and it's a generalisation, than England. It is intrinsically, culturally more democratic. There is a big difference, and I've experienced it. I didn't know about it before particularly. I've experienced it. So it's much more, that's why St Fagans was the way it was. You know, it was intended to be a people's museum. So therefore the staff, many of the staff have got, particularly the Welsh staff, and I have to say, often, very often, the Welsh-speaking staff too, particularly, have got built into them the idea that this is the culture that belongs to the people. And that means that when we're working in the way we're trying to here, they lead me, I don't lead them for those particular staff. What I do is give them permission to work in that kind of way and encourage them to work in that kind of way. There are other staff who would never wish to buy into the philosophy that I've been describing to you tonight. And we need a diversity of staff, we always do. Not everybody is skilled at co-production and collaborative working. So there may be other roles for them in an organisation which are to do with research and research funding and things like that. But actually as an organisation we do have to shift, and briefly the vision document I put up on the screen there and didn't talk much about, embedded in that is what do people in Wales need? What exhibitions do they need? What online services do they need? What learning do they need? What opportunities for cultural participation? Our strapline is making a difference for Wales. And we're always that question. And there are very many ways in which we can do it, but not all staff will get there. And to be honest, the staff that we will fight hardest to keep through these cuts will be the ones who will take that vision forwards. And that won't be all. I'm afraid it won't be all staff.
Shall I, or?
Oh, I beg your pardon.
So,
do you want to go first then, if you're next? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. So my question is related to the culture policy environment, that being a national museum, so what role is identified with your activities and services that you provide to the public? So from a managerial perspective, we know that we are in the era of social change, and you have very extensively explained this role. But Turkey is also experiencing a harsh debate on the National Arts Council. And I would like to ask you the autonomy problem, that if you are experiencing any with your role in the cultural policy system and structure. Thank you.
Okay. Any publicly funded organisation in the United Kingdom, anyway, faces the issue of autonomy to some degree or another, and the pushing of the boundaries sometimes by government. And sometimes you have a minister who has much better ideas about exhibitions and what they should be than he believes the museum staff have too. I couldn't possibly comment on that. I think so far we haven't had a major problem with it in Wales, or nor, I have to say, was there a major problem in England either with that. Partly because the Welsh Government has put child poverty as its highest policy priority, addressing child poverty as that. So anybody who can come up with ideas for how to address that, in principle, will be welcomed. I am not doing this, we are not doing this because the government wants their child poverty issues to be addressed. We're doing it because I believe it's intrinsic to our role, our ethical responsibility as a museum to do that. We're funded by the public. We are there for every person in Wales, every child and every adult. So this is a logical consequence of that. But they do sometimes try to tell us how we should do it. And at that point, we have to try to negotiate our way through as best we can. But essentially, since the government and ourselves on these areas are trying to reach the same targets, there isn't a major philosophical problem. There's issues of how best to do it. But I mean, we've got a unique, in the UK anyway, responsibility being given to us that we've been asked to lead the research and evaluation on how culture can work to try to address poverty. And there is a national programme in Wales getting started on this area in the arts and separately in the historic museums and heritage sector to do this. And this is the first time in 150 years since the great experiment that I talked about in my talk there from England, the first time to try to bring together education and culture at a national level in one of the countries of the United Kingdom. So this is going to be a big experiment, and we've been given a central research role in that ourselves. Sorry, yes.
Thank you very much. That was very inspiring indeed, and best of luck with more success. I had a question that's a little bit relevant, repetitive of the last question, but about the economic aspect of this. And is this co-production process that you're engaged in also helping the local economy? You did mention the poverty-stricken communities, and are you also addressing something like reviving traditional industries? Are there ways that you can do this?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think I'd say that more apprentices, yes, but we've got very few so far because funding them is difficult. Lots of volunteers. We've got about 2,000 volunteer days last year that we had working with the museum. That's growing very rapidly. And in terms of economic regeneration, yes, we have got historic traditional crafts, and we're going to expand that. We're going to do lots and lots and lots of courses for the public on all kinds of skills, from brewing beer to beekeeping to woodwork, everything you can imagine, really. But try to include contemporary skills like digital skills as part of this. We don't want it just to be a kind of archive of old traditions, really, in this. But these things only work if everybody is trying to do it. It's not just us in one museum or all our museums. You know, that this is where the government initiative is so important. If you want to make a difference, it has to be a collective effort across the country. And that is what we are putting the first steps in Wales towards doing. And see again in 5 years' time how much success we've had on this. We've almost no money to do it. And not everybody in the cultural sector wants to be honest, even in Wales. And maybe not many people have got the skills to do it. So we've got a big task on our hands. But there is also a lot of will in a lot of areas to do it. So let's see on that.
Thank you very much. It's really inspiring. I'm coming right now from Ukraine, and from and we actually, I mean, a lot of people from the museum fields believe that everything that is happening in the southeast of our country is actually government neglect towards culture and education. And I mean, what you're saying about this education and culture being basically a backbone of any nation, on which the economy just is a part of it. But what I wanted to ask, you started talking about the education, about your work with schools. I mean, as I understand, in order to make this program bigger, you will have to have a joint curriculum, or, I mean, how are you going to work this out? Do you have any ideas how it's going to work?
Well, Scotland has been very much more successful than England, or come to that so far, Wales or Northern Ireland, in rethinking its curriculum and putting creativity much more central to the curriculum. England is a basket case on this. I mean, educationally, I'm an ex-teacher, disaster zone. I mean, it's very ideological, very much about traditional learning that disempowers large numbers of children. And far too much of Welsh education has been copying the English model. There is actually going to be announced very shortly a new curriculum for Wales. We in the museum and many others have tried to influence that, and I think we'll just have to see how successful we've been. I mean, I think we'll be very lucky to get as far as Scotland, because the right-wing press everywhere is always attacking anything else but the most traditional educational methods. We'll just see how courageous our Welsh ministers are when it comes to doing what I think in their heart of hearts they know is needed to change. If we can get halfway to where Scotland is, I'll be really happy, and there'll be a much bigger role for museums and galleries through the curriculum. But we've always had a role of being the complement and the alternative to the curriculum as well as part of the curriculum. And we get 250,000 school children come in school parties to our 7 museums each year, but we get 750,000 children with adults coming each year. So we mustn't forget the families, we mustn't forget the informal learning. And in many ways, we can reach some children much better outside the school system than we can inside it. We need both. I'm not arguing against working with schools, but let's remember there are the two worlds. There's that invisible universe of informal learning. We have to work with that. So even if the curriculum is a disaster, there is another way.
Your talk was very enlightening, as was the case 10 years ago, your talk in History Foundation at that time. But for a typical Turkish listener of your talk, the balance of forces, especially the political forces in the country, the traditional local democracy, the tradition of cultural heritage as a movement, and so on, are so different. Then the main question, once more, how to move forward under this totally different political constellation in many countries of the world. For example, during the last 15 or 20 years, first in Imperial Mint İstanbul City History Museum, and then in Antalya City Museum History projects with Gülpulhan together, we managed more or less the same vision of the same understanding of a museum, the function of a museum as a learning center for the community, and changing the life of the native people and creating something positive for the vision of the local people for future and so on. But we don't have a cultural heritage preservation movement in Turkey, as was the case in Britain, maybe the most important, most powerful heritage movement in the world. Due to many reasons, I can send you a recent article of mine about the non-existence of a cultural heritage preservation movement in Turkey. And our heritage preservation and museum understanding, to a large extent, is part of the ruling social forces rather than coming from the below, from the trade union movement, from the workers' movement, left movement, liberal democratic movement, and so on and so forth. You know more or less at least the basics of the differences. What do you propose us?
I was very careful to start this by saying that each museum world has to develop in its own culture, really. And as you will have realized, I know very little about Turkey's. I mean, in a sense, I feel this is a personal challenge for every individual, as well as a challenge for institutions. And each of us has choices in our lives as to how we use our lives and how we professionally operate. And we all have, and I've made them, we all have to make compromises on occasions and not be doing the things one most believes in, to try to preserve something that one does believe in. So I suppose part of the answer to that is personal, and I shouldn't ever underestimate how difficult it may be to be operating in a situation where you feel that your philosophy and your ambitions are minority ones, or are not listened to, or are not funded, and in some ways are not possible. So it would be wrong of me to say, of course, one must always work in those conditions and put up with those conditions, because I haven't had to do that myself, and I shouldn't give advice that I haven't ever had to apply. But I suppose that the recognition of that is just a human truth, really, that we all have decisions to make. And I would like to think that even if some small part of what each of us does is towards something we believe in, then that's been very, very worthwhile. If I can give an historical analogy, which may seem rather remote, which is that my academic background is in Irish history, believe it or not, that in the early 1890s, the Irish parliamentary group in London, which was trying to get independence for Ireland, split. And really democratic parliamentary nationalism fell apart. It was probably one of the darkest periods in terms of the nationalist movement in Ireland, well, until the Troubles in Belfast and Northern Ireland and all the rest of it. But anyway, what happened there was that very, very many young people who'd been active in politics became disgusted with politics, and they went and worked in the land movement, the language movement, the campaigns for rural rights, all sorts of things, everything you could imagine, except politics, overtly. 25 years later, 1916, a small group symbolically decide to use weapons to take over the post office in Dublin. It's an act of political nationalism using violence, and people died on both sides in this. A symbolic act. And at that point, by and large, you would have thought that the elections which had been held, this is during the First World War, indicated that those parties which were essentially for negotiating with England through parliamentary process were the dominant group in England. Within days, the English started to shoot individually in prison many of the survivors from that attack on the post office. Public opinion turned very, very rapidly from being essentially pro-United Kingdom, but with wanting to get some degree of independence, to being really hostile to England. I'm exaggerating and simplifying, but nevertheless, there was a shift. There was a tipping point happened. And historians have tried to understand why it was that that tipping point was so quick. And one of the best explanations that some have come up with is that all those young people in their 20s and 30s in the 1890s who went to the land movement, the language movement, and literary movement, and so on, they sowed the seeds in their work for the change of mentality that a quarter of a century later appeared. So, I would never defend a lot of what happened in Ireland, but nevertheless, all one can say is you never quite know where change is going to come from, because the Irish certainly didn't predict it correctly. So maybe it's equally hard for us to do so. Okay, are we?
Thank you very much, David, for this tremendously challenging and inspiring talk. Thank you again, the British Council, for enabling us to host a series of museums talk. The next talk will be held next week, actually, on the 13th of February. So you're all welcome to join us, and have a good night. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
you.